Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Castleberry. Today, we are going to be going over the midlife planning presentation. So, for those of you that aren't aware, we do these presentations on a monthly basis for all county employees. We also provide them as a recording on our website as well to view later on. But we've gone through a series this year. Last month was the first of this two-part series. We did early life planning, so planning really the decade after you graduate college. Today, we're going to be doing midlife planning. So, really planning around your 40s and 50s at that point, what that looks like, what challenges you have during that period of life, and really just trying to make sure you're essentially looking at any major changes you have, any major milestones you're hitting as life starting to settle down, what your strengths and weaknesses are during this period, but just trying to give you a good overall view of what to think about and what to start looking at when you're getting into this period. So, first off, kind of looking at middle age. So, that's where we're talking about that middle age time group. So, really, that 40s to 50s, sometimes even getting into your early 60s. I think technically you're looking at later midlife is the 50s to 60s, early midlife is 36 to 50. We're probably going to be right in a blended range from this just sweatered up individual to this bearded with a tie individual. I guess that's assuming everyone 50 or older just has a beard and is bald naturally, something I'm slowly shooting for at this point. But really, we're probably going to be looking at that kind of late 30s into 40s and then 50s time frame. So one thing I do want to address before we really jump into this is when we talk about middle age or talk about midlife, a lot of times one of the topics that comes up is midlife crisis. It's the sports car, it's the whatever, it's a major life change. In some cases, unfortunately, that can be a divorce. There's just a lot of kind of negative connotation around this middle age, even to the point where I tell people, hey, we're doing a middle age presentation. And they're like, well, I'm not middle age. I'm only 45. And I'm like, oh, well, it's targeted directly at you. So you could sugarcoat it however you want. But I want to say that because middle age really, I don't think is nearly or should be nearly as negative as it is. Really, what you're looking at and what I found a lot of times in talking to individuals is it just gets to a period of what I like to call stabilization and looking at that way rather than like stagnation. Because what you typically see early life, teens, 20s, and even into your 30s and early 30s, life is happening extremely quickly. You are more than likely treading water to try and keep up. You're going through school, you're getting into college, you're getting married, you're having your first child, you're moving out, you're starting your career, you're navigating the start of your career. Everything's happening very, very quickly. There's a lot of really, really major life events that happen prior to you hitting your late 30s and to your 40s. And then you get into that late 30s and 40s, and then everything slows down a little bit. You're raising your children at that point. You're well into your career. So you're probably not seeing career advancement nearly as quickly. You're probably not seeing income increase nearly as quickly. You're not having as many life changes, like personal life changes. You're probably done having children. You're probably in the home you're going to be for a while. You're probably well into your marriage at that point. So you're just seeing life slow down. And then I think what tends to happen is a lot of people take that slowdown is a negative view to where, all right, well, there's really nothing left. There's nothing to drive me anymore. When in reality, this is one of the best times of your life to get to raise your children, but two, also to get to start to plan for that post work period or the rest of your life, because you're starting to hit a level where you're seeing your income be probably in a fairly significant uptick from early life. You're starting to get some resources saved under your belt. Your life is starting to level out a little bit. So you can really make some valuable planning during this period, because the next 20 to 30 to 50 years are a lot stabler looking, or at least start to become a lot clearer to you than what they looked like when you were still going through all of those changes. So I like this because it kind of shows this potential track of just going down and viewing everything as it's a decline to the track of, all right, using this time, learning from it, improving yourself on it, but really building a plan from a retirement plan standpoint and using this time to really maximize the utility you can get out of your life for the remainder of it. So I always just like to talk about this when we talk about midlife planning, because it is something that can have that negative connotation when in reality it's just shifting to a new phase that has a lot of pros to it. So looking at those, we kind of hit on them just a second ago, but your strengths and weaknesses. So strengths, you're getting to your higher earning years. You're starting to earn more than you used to prior. Life started to level out for you. So again, you're going through less of those major changes, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. You typically have greater resources at this time period as well. So excuse me, you're typically at a point where you've had time to start to build up some resources. So you've built up some savings. You're starting to see some momentum grow in your investment accounts and your retirement accounts. So you're having some benefit of those saving years you had prior to, where you're starting to see some actual growth there. Now you do have some weaknesses, and I say like time. So time being a strength when you're younger is slowly starting to work against you now. So if you were not started saving for retirement, the ability to be able to pause retirement savings and do other things you would want to focus on is starting to go away. You're now to a point where you really need to be doing multiple things at once, which can be kind of difficult because you're also looking at new expenses rather than the expenses of making new purchases. You're now looking at paying off your mortgage, paying for potential college, raising your children at that point. So even though it's a more leveled out area and you do have higher earnings and you've had the ability to maybe build some resources up, and I apologize, I'm literally already had 2 cups of coffee, and I think I'm probably just talking a little fast, but you're still going through a pretty expensive period of your life at that point as well. So you have that going for you. The other weakness, and this is, I'd say, a weakness if you haven't done it. It could be a strength if you're starting it, but you're probably having to start a fresh look, is building a plan. If you don't have a plan yet, this is when you really need to start to build one, because this is when you can really start to build a plan that is going to be very, very easy to optimize. And it's going to be a lot easier to plan long term as you're getting to a period where you're starting to see a lot of major shifts level out. So you're not having to plan around a bunch of, well, if I get this job and start this career, I'll make this. Well, if I get married and do this, I'll make this. Well, if I have this many kids, a lot of those big things are behind you. Now it's, here's my career path. Here's what my family spends on a monthly basis. Here's what I'm planning for college. Here's what my wife and I spend just on ourselves. You have some flexibility there to really be able to solidify a lot of those long-term projections for at least an expense standpoint. And you can start to really map out and make a lot more solid of a plan. So I want to start kind of hitting on all these and then going and wrapping up with building a plan at the end of it. So we'll start with income and resources. So income, again, you're hitting your peak income years for most people, mid 40s, early 50s, and then you start to see that drop off. And again, some of that's just people leaving the workforce at that point, but you're getting through those years where you're seeing really, really rapid income jumps from like the 20s to the 20s and early 30s, and the late 30s, 40s. It's starting to slow down a little bit. You're kind of peaking off here, but this jump right here and this jump right here are really the two biggest ones on that upward trajectory at this point. And then you're also looking at just seeing resources. So the sheer amount of time you've had to be able to save is shifting up. So you're going to have maybe a larger balance in your emergency savings. You're going to start to build up a balance in your 401k. So now if emergencies do happen, they're ideally not as detrimental. You can adjust for them. You can plan around them. You can cover them because you've had time to build those resources up. Now, I like to show this too in conjunction with that average income, because what you typically see, and this really fits into that midlife crisis kind of standpoint as well, is for both men and women. And I'm not going to talk about the pay discrepancy here. I really just want to show the trend of this is you see those early years. So those those late 20s into 30s, that income growth potential is really there. It's fairly high at that point. You're seeing a lot of growth. You get into those early 40s and you start to see that level and cap out. Typically, you see like there's early career moves. You're being able to see promotions a little bit faster. You're making career switches or company switches to try and really leverage your income up a little bit. You start to get into your 40s and your higher earning years, and usually one of a few things are happening. You're either trying to go towards like a more management track at that point, and you get to a level where there's only so many directors or so many VPs or so many C-level individuals in any organization. So it just becomes a lot fewer opportunities for advancement and a lot harder to fill those opportunities for advancement. Again, because you have kind of maybe the lower, the middle manager opportunities where there might be 15 or 20 available. But at some point, you're going to get to a handful of options available to go forward. So you might see yourself be in one position for a lot longer time period. And then you're looking at just maybe hitting the top of that pay scale and looking at cost of living adjustments at that point. So you have that route, or you go into the route where you're not the manager side, but you're kind of independent contributor at that point. You're really working in a skilled position, but not a management position. And you're just starting to get to where you've had a decade under your belt. You're getting to be really that expert level in your field, and you're really filling into the role that you see yourself being in long term, but you're starting to hit just into a pay scale wall at that point where without moving into a higher position or potentially moving to management, the ability to increase your income starts to level out a little bit. So you just see this tapering off here. Goodness, you see this tapering off here happen, and again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just something, make sure you're planning around it. So if you are starting to build a plan in your early 40s, don't plan for the same sort of income progression you might have seen in your 30s, just because that might, again, not be the case at that point. Now, life is starting to level out for you, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a major life event standpoint as well. So, one thing I like to show with this is a list of major kind of personal life changes at that point. If you'll notice, most of these take place really early in your life. Between that, what I'd call middle age, you're looking at one, two, really three of those here. Retirement's going to be later in life. Death of the spouse is going to be later in life. So you really have three that are going to sit within your 40s or 50s. It's going to be potentially for divorce. Again, that's that early 40s, kind of that peak of that midlife crisis chart. You have children leaving home. Again, that's going to typically be for most people late 40s, early 50s. And then usually the death of the parent. So again, a couple of these or all of these have the potential to be really financially dramatic if you get an inheritance, or if a child leaves home, it's usually because they're going to college. And then after that, it's a little bit of an alleviation to you because they're no longer on the payroll. They start to be independent and on their own. And then divorce. Divorce is arguably, in my opinion, probably one of the most destructive for anyone's wealth at that point, splitting it in half, no longer to having that two income household support. That can be very detrimental at that point. But again, there's a lot less changes than if you look in your 30s where you're getting married, you're moving in together, you're potentially separating from a partner or multiple partners as you're trying to find the person you're marrying at that point. You're leaving your parents' house, you're having your first child, you're going through periods of employment and unemployment, you're having your first job. So there's a lot of major changes that take place during that time period. And again, that's starting to slow down. So you can start to plan, start to map out for a little bit more stability there. And then, two, from an expense standpoint, you're starting to see where your natural spending is developing. So, even if you don't track or you don't budget, you're starting to see where the pieces of your kind of overall pie are being allocated. You start to see maybe house get paid off. You start to see maybe clothing and child care start to drop off. You know, kind of what's going to go into every category at that point. But that's starting to cement with what's just very natural for you to fall into. So you're able to project that and say, all right, well, if this is what I spend now, let's kind of maybe plan on that inflating up to be something equivalent to this in retirement, and I can start to map out what I want to be saving based on that. Next is going to be time. So I want to go over two things here quickly for time. Both of these charts are going to be kind of busy, but it's going to be things you can think of as if you're trying to build some check marks for yourself. So some benchmarks to hit, if you will. So I want to look at just a couple examples. So what this chart is looking at, based on again some pretty decent assumptions here, um, with what your current income is, at what age you need to try and shoot for having a certain amount saved. So, like if you're 40 and you make 50 grand, I'm using this example down here so you can see it. So, if you're 40, you make 50 grand, ideally by age 40, you should have about $70,000 saved or 1.4% of your income. Now, as you start to make more, that starts to increase even on age. And a lot of that's going to be because in retirement, the amount of income you'll get from Social Security is going to be less based on your income, which we'll talk about later. But just know if you are just wanting to have a milestone, you've probably seen these in Yahoo Finance, you've probably seen these in Market Watch articles very, very frequently. And one thing you'll more than likely notice is what numbers they use can vary pretty dramatically at that point. So when you're looking at this, if you want just to use this and say, hey, what's a goal I can set? What's something I can have? You want to plan for this. But by no means is this, hey, if you don't have 1.4% of your salary saved by 40, you're in a bad position. That's not the case. You can play catch up. It's not going to be the same for everyone, but this is just a very general milestone you might want to look at. Now, if you don't have that saved, what this chart is saying is how much do you need to save in order to hit your retirement goal if you've started from zero. So same scenario, if you're 50,000 and age 40, so 50,000 salary, age 40, you have not saved anything before. With these same assumptions here, you need to be saving 13% of your income. Now, one of the cool things, this is 13% of your income that you need to be saving, but it's not necessarily all from your own savings. That's going to be 13%, including employer match. And for Forsyth County employees, with the county 401k match that is extremely, extremely generous at that point in time, if you've been with the county for 5 years or even after 1 year, what you can really start to look at with this is okay, well, if I put in 5%, the county matches 5, and then they put in a blanket 5. So if I put in 5%, that means 15% of my 401k contribution is going toward, like, there's 15% of my income going towards my 401k. So you hit that 13 plus 2 there, with you only having to feel the effects of 5. So if you are looking at this as a county employee and you're like, man, I'm 45, I make 60 grand, I need to put 19% in, but I'm not used to putting any in, I'm used to spending that. It's very difficult to go from 0 to almost 20%. It's a lot easier to go from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, knowing that if you're at the county for 10 years or longer, if you put in 10%, they put in 15, which is phenomenal. So you could get 25% of your income coming in just by putting in 10%. So you only have to feel 10% of that, and then you can get up to 25. So it really allows you, even if you are starting later in life, you have the ability to put a lot less in than you would normally have to, because the county match can cover the difference. If you have a spouse or you don't work for the county and you have a 4% match or a 5% match, something that's not as aggressive as what you'd see from the county offering, then it's a little bit more on you, which really it's incentivizing you then to start saving earlier so you don't have to be in the position where you're going from I've never saved anything to now I'm supposed to work around my budget that I'm really used to now to save 25%. That's extremely difficult, especially when you're looking at that at the same time you're probably paying for college. So college, what I want to look at really is just average college cost. We have an entire presentation on college, an entire presentation going over college cost. So I don't want to spend too much time on here. If it's something that's what you're going through right now and you have questions about kind of loans or averages in there, again, I very much encourage you to check out our college planning presentation. It's a lot more in depth just on this topic, but you look at kind of, so public schools or private schools or out of state schools. So private schools typically tend to be a lot more expensive. Public schools, depending on your in state or out of state. One thing I will say, if you're I really do apologize. If you're looking at colleges in our area, so like a UGA, a Georgia Tech, a UNG, or a Georgia State at that point, so really the big four that are kind of around us, you're ranging on an annual basis probably somewhere between 25 and 28,000. So that 27 is pretty accurate for our area. And again, a lot of that's going to dictate is your kid living on campus? Are they not living on campus? What does that look like? So again, just look at that and just know college is one of those things that you're going to see that inflate up pretty aggressively across the board. So again, looking at probably one of the highest annual inflation rates of anything out there. So it's going to be added. And then two, ultimately, don't expect scholarships to cover the way. With Georgia, you have the Hope Scholarship, so that can cover a lot of tuition if your child gets it. But if not, if you're looking at other scholarships, it's very rare that someone gets a full ride via scholarships. It's even rarer to get that from like an athletic or like education based. So you can try and piece together with a lot of smaller scholarships, but just be aware that it does create a little bit of, I think, sometimes an overly optimistic look of what it'll actually cover at that point, because you typically don't see a lot of that being covered, and you're still looking at having to fit a lot of that potentially $25,000 out of pocket. Now, one thing I do like to hit on at this is really going to be along the lines of, if you are saving for college, and if you're a parent that's, hey, I want to be able to do something, at least help my kid out, a lot of times you'll see them emphasize college over retirement. And it's because they don't want their kid to start with student loans. They want to put their kid in a great financial position. I'm always very cautious about this, just because, say, you can get student loans for college, you can get scholarships for college, you can work your way through college and spread college out a little bit. But at a certain point, there's not scholarships for retirement. You can't get a loan for retirement. You can't work your way through retirement, because then it's not retirement. You're just working. And there's going to come a time where you physically or mentally are not going to be able to work anymore. So then it really leaves two options. You're either a burden to your children and they have to care for you, or you whittle your life down to be just enough to where Social Security can cover it and you're just getting by, and any sort of emergency throws you into a tailwind. So I say that keep that in mind when you're planning around college. No, if you want to help your kids out, do it, but don't sacrifice retirement savings, because even if you're trying to give your kids a head up so that they are burden free starting out their life, just know you could potentially be a burden to them at the same time they're trying to pay for their kids' college. So just keep that in mind. I see that's a lot of times it's a hard conversation to have, but maybe it's a conversation you have with your child, says, hey, I'm going to be able to afford to give you $5,000 or $10,000 of help or no help. Just know, make wise decisions on whether you want to live on campus, whether you want to work, so that you can do something that is going to be beneficial for you, where they can maybe not get the super expensive school and not get on a ton of debt, but still be able to get the education that they want at that point. So keeping that in mind. Now, as far as building a plan here, so where do you start? So if you're starting in your 40s, you're starting your 50s, where do you start on that plan building? And if you've seen any of my videos, you've probably seen this before. Cash flow. Cash flow is, in my opinion, the number one foundation for building any sort of financial plan. If you do not know what happens when you get your paycheck every month and when that paycheck gets spent, that is the first thing I always recommend you do. Is, even if you're not budgeting per se, at least tracking your expenses so you know where everything's going. You have a good idea of what you need to live on so you can start planning for that future. And I say, like, this doesn't have to be an exact science. It doesn't have to be a down to the dollar. As long as you know pretty roughly, hey, we spend ballpark between like 35 and 38 or 45 and 48. But even like a few $100 difference in what you're projecting for living on in retirement, that can make a really big deal because you take that over potentially 25, 35 years of retirement, you inflate that up. $100 to $200 difference on a monthly basis can be pretty significant. So just that's the first piece, because again, every other part of your retirement plan is going to be built on that cash flow management. Just making sure you know where you need to be planning for, because that really gets into a couple of questions. So you're going to start with like kind of your bigger questions and isolate those down. But once you know kind of, hey, this is what I spend, then you can start nailing down, all right, what does that look like for the big questions I need to answer? Do you plan on retiring prior to 59 and a half or after 59 and a half? Do you want to work part-time in retirement? When do you want to take Social Security? What's healthcare going to be? So if you're retiring prior to 59 and a half, you know that there's certain retirement accounts that limit your ability to pull prior to that. There's some that allow you to pull after that. So just know that's a pretty significant milestone. So if all of your assets are in an IRA, we'll know that that's going to be locked up until after 59 and a half. So do you have anything in a brokerage account? What are you saving? That Do you want to work part-time in retirement? Do you want to work maybe a few years longer and then not have to work part-time, or retire a little bit early for your full-time position and then work part-time? Do you know what your Social Security estimate is? Do you know when you're going to take it? Do you know how you're going to cover healthcare costs? Are you going to be able to stay on the county's plan? Are you not going to be able to? Is your spouse going to be able to? What does that look like? So these are the big questions you need to ask. And it's like, so once you start knowing those and you're like, all right, that's what I want to shoot for. I probably want to do this. At least this is where my Social Security is coming from, then you can start to map out everything else. And then it gets into much smaller, much more direct questions. So, all right, what's my monthly income need? All right, so if I'm retiring 60 and I know from managing my cash flow now, I live on like $4,500, give or take, 100 north or south. What do I want my monthly income to be? Well, I want to maintain same lifestyle, but maybe my mortgage is going to be paid off. So out of that 4,500, the mortgage might be, let's say, 1,500 of that. So that drops that down. And I'm probably not, like, my car payment will be paid off. If you have like an RV or any debt payments, those will be paid off. So maybe I need like roughly, let's say ballpark, like 3 grand or $2,800. And that's going to be food, utilities, entertainment, living expenses, whatever. And then you look at, all right, so that's core monthly living needs. Well, now what about vacations, hobbies, other goals that I want to do? So do I want to travel? Do I have a hobby I really want to jump into? So if it's vacations and you're not necessarily baking those into your monthly planning, it's like, all right, well, I want to take at least 3 vacations a year and I want to do one big one, two small ones. All right, so we plan around how much do I need to have to cover those? And then when it comes to hobbies, I often like to look at hobbies as what is the best version of whatever you do now. Because I always ask people, like, oh, well, what hobbies do you have? And as much as I genuinely hate that question, because my TV shows is a weird answer to the hobbies that I watch. Or like, oh, I watch TV and I watch movies. And then, like, I whatever else you might do. So that could be gardening, that could be fixing old cars, that could be playing video games, that could be fishing, that could be painting small figurines, whatever it might be, just something you enjoy spending your time doing, or something you at least want to try thinking about. That could be golfing, it could be a sport, pickleball, tennis, whatever, at that point. But just think about the best version of that, because ultimately, if you do travel, you're not going to travel 365. So there's going to be a lot of days in retirement that you are not necessarily have anything planned. If you have grandkids or family close, that'll take up some time, but again, not necessarily all the time. So what do you want to spend that random Tuesday or Wednesday or Friday afternoon doing? And do you want to do the best version of it? Well, some of those are far more expensive than others. Like if you fix up old cars and that's what you want to spend your time doing, that can be a lot more expensive hobby than if you have your shows or video games or fishing that might not be as much depending on the type of fishing. But I say that, think about the best version. So if it is something like you watch your TV shows, well, do you want a surround sound system? Do you want a really nice TV? Do you want to be able to upgrade that TV every few years? Do you want a certain chair, a certain sofa, a certain way you want that room to be designed to where that maximizes your experience, because that'll be something you spend a lot of your time doing. So you want to make sure it is the best version of it at that point. So just make sure you're planning for those hobbies in there, whatever they are. And I know a lot of people's like, oh, I don't have hobbies. Well, whatever you do now, you're probably going to be doing more of it. So think about that and think about the best version of it. Then plan for major expenses. So the things like home repair, so that could be AC unit, hot water heater, roof, flood damage. Just make sure you're also taking into account there's going to be major one-off expenses at some point in time in your retirement, and you are going to need to make sure that you do those well, or at least able to take care of those well at that point. So if it is, hey, my refrigerator went out, you want to make sure you can replace it with a similar model and not have to be like, oh, well, let me just get this one off Craigslist that I'm pretty sure works sometimes, at least enough to not spoil anything. And then car purchases. Again, retirement may or may not be 25 to 35 years for you. So there's going to be enough time where you're going to have probably multiple car purchases. So make sure you're planning for those and make sure you're planning for the type of car you're going to want to purchase as well. Again, that sometimes can be a little bit cheaper because you might not be looking for the SUV to carry kids. You might be looking for a sedan, or you might just be looking for something that's a little bit easier and it might not be as flashy as you once wanted at that point. And then healthcare expenses. So this is not necessarily going to be like healthcare prior to Medicare, but maybe healthcare after later life. So look at, all right, well, do you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's in your family? Do you have, are you a smoker? What's your longevity look like in your family? Do you have any sort of pre-existing medical conditions that are going to cause a lot more medical expenses? Are you taking that into account? So it's not just, hey, what are my monthly living expenses? But you want to be able to answer all of these questions to say, all right, how much will I spend in retirement? How much do I plan? And once you can kind of answer those pretty definitively, then it becomes, well, how much do I need to have saved to cover that? And this is where it gets into, there's really two avenues for most people to have as far as income sources in retirement. You're going to have Social Security and you're going to have retirement savings. Some people still have a pension, but for most people, these are the two that you're looking at. And Social Security is not designed to cover all of your living expenses. It's not designed to be a full replacement, which, if we think back to that previous chart where the more you make, the higher that percentage you needed to save was. So if we come back over here and we go to this and say, all right, well, if you are 40 and you make 30,000, you need to save 6%. But if you're 40 and you make 60,000, you need to save 14%. Well, the reason for that is when you look at Social Security, based on what your income is the amount that it's designed to cover. So what that actual Social Security payout is, if you're making $40,000, well, it's designed to replace 60% of your income. But if you're making $100,000, it's only designed to replace 44% of your income. So the more you make, the more emphasis is on you to actually be the one saving to replace that income. So don't think that Social Security is going to replace everything, even if you're making $30,000 a year, which is this one behind my face. You're still only expected to get about 73% of that back from a Social Security benefit. And if you're making $300,000 a year, well, 16% of that's what you can expect from Social Security. So just keep that in mind, because you are going to have to cover the remainder of your living expenses from your own retirement savings, which again, you see those get much larger down here in blue as you make more. So what that requires then is, all right, well, roughly how much do I need to have saved? And a good rule of thumb is you want to be able to not have to pull more than 4% a year from your account balance to cover your living expenses. Because if you do get to that 35-year retirement here, if you pull 4% a year from your investment accounts, that's going to have a really good likelihood of at least giving you some remainder. If you start to pump that to 5% or 6%, there's a higher likelihood that you are going to run out of money maybe sometime in your late 80s or sometime in your early 80s at that point in time. And again, that's just a higher risk than most people are willing to take at that point. Now, this is again, it's going to vary based on how you're invested. It's going to vary based on what type of accounts you have as far as the tax liability. But a good rule of thumb is at 4%. Now, again, that's not going to be the absolute you need to shoot for, but is a good rule of thumb. There is going to be a lot of customized personal variations. So, what you want to look at and what we help people do as far as building that financial plan, and with the county, if you want to come meet with us, again, all of those costs are covered by Forsyth County. So, there's no cost to the employee at that point. Is be able to say, all right, well, with where you're sitting today, what you want to spend, you need to save 13%, or you need to save 10% or 9% or 5% to give you a very precise outlook of like, hey, with how you're invested, with what you want to do, this is what you need to do at that point. So you can go in confidently knowing, all right, with what my Social Security projection is and with what I have in assets, what do I need to do to make 60 a possibility, make 61 possible, 62 possible, and be able to cover all of those expenses from healthcare to vacations to hobbies to home repair to car purchase and living expenses. So that automatically leads to the next thing, which is, all right, where should I invest at that point? How do I need to invest? Like what do I need to do? Well, I'd say the first thing is not cash. So a lot of people they have probably a decent amount more in cash than they probably should. What this chart shows is essentially what a dollar was worth in 1913. So if you start 1913, where a dollar is worth a dollar, and then you track what that dollar is worth over now, as of 2019, that dollar is worth about 10 cents. As of 2022, that dollar is probably worth a good bit less at that point than 10 cents. So what happens every year is, even though dollars seem really safe because they don't fluctuate, like if you have $10 in your bank account, next week you're going to have $10. Next year you're going to have $10. And the next 20 years you're going to have $10. But what does fluctuate is how much does that dollar actually purchase? Because in 10 years, that $10 might not purchase the same amount it purchased today. If today that $10 buys you a candy bar, which again, it's an expensive candy bar, 10 years from now, it might buy you a M&M at that point in time. So just know, even though it feels safe and it is safe on a short term, it is the riskiest asset you can have on a long-term trajectory. So what you need to do is you need to be invested in something. So typically I talk about investing in the stock market, which is stocks and bonds at that point in time, but some people invest in real estate, some people invest in collectibles, and there are different risks to all of them. I'm going to specifically be talking about stock market returns at this point, but just know you need to have some form of investment, but just know the risk and know there's a whole plethora of options you can do. I'd say the most common one is probably stock market investing inside your 401k, in your 457, in your 403b, or in your IRA at that point. And then you also have like people with rental properties and avenues along those lines. But I say this to say, when you're looking at stocks, bonds, and cash and everything, so what this shows is stocks, bonds, and then a blend of 50-50 of both. And it's showing you rolling average annual returns from 1950 to 2022. So what we see on any 1 year during that 72-year period, stocks have had an annual return of negative 39%, but they've also had a return of positive 47%. Bonds have had a negative return of 13, which I believe was last year, or a positive return of 43%. Bonds, worst has been negative 15, best is in positive 33. So it's a pretty broad range. You see bonds are a little bit safer on a 1 year. Balance is a little bit safer on a 1 year. Stocks are the most risky on a 1 year. A rolling 5 year, the worst average annual on a rolling 5 year period is negative 3%. The best is 28. Bonds negative 2, 23. A balanced portfolio is actually 1% positive, 21% is the bottom. So any rolling 5-year period, a blended balance, like half and half portfolio, is done pretty well at that point. We go rolling 10-year period. Worst rolling 10-year period in that time period for stocks is -1%. So that's if that, I believe that is if you bought beginning of 2000, right at the top of the tech bubble, and then the bubble burst, and then you sold 2010. So that decade, at that point where you had the financial crisis and the dot-com bubble, that provided the worst rolling 10-year return. Bonds so far have not had a negative rolling 10-year return during that 72-year period, in a blending portfolio as well. If you look here on a rolling 20-year period, so any rolling 20-year period in this 72-year range, stocks have been the best performer. They, on the low end, they've had the average annual of 6. On the high end, the average annual of 17. That has been the best performer out of all of those. And again, you need something that can help fight inflation and help fight tax cost. Equities and stocks, so that's the same thing. Stocks are going to be the best avenue for you to do that. You are not going to be able to do that with cash. You are not going to be able to save enough in your working years to and keep it in cash to be able to make it through retirement. So, kind of put it differently, look at this. So, the amount of risk and the amount of time. So, on a short term, stocks are the riskiest, bonds and cash are the safest. On the long term, stocks become the least risky, again, because that long term return is much better. Whereas cash and bonds become far more risky because the likelihood is they will not keep up with the purchasing power of inflation at that point. So you need something, at least short term, to kind of provide like an emergency fund or anything like that. But long term, you still need something to grow. So that's going to be where you're going for stocks, which again, riskiest short term, best bet for you long term. And investing, again, you're investing for the future. So you're not investing for next year, you're not even necessarily investing for 5 years from now. If you are in your midlife, you're investing for either 25 years from now, 5 years, or 10 years from now, or you're investing for 5 years now to start taking income, but you still need money if you're 59 for 69, 79, 89. So you still need growth 10, 20, 30 years out from now. So you still need something in your portfolio that has that long-term growth route like stocks, because again, you're not going to retire day one and spend everything. You need something to be growing for you for the later years of retirement. Now, to wrap things up, can you answer these questions ultimately? So, if you cannot answer these questions, this is where I would strongly recommend you meet with a financial planner. If you're a county employee, please reach out to me. I'll have my contact information in the next slide at that point. So, do you know when you plan to retire? So, do you know when you want to shoot? Have you thought about when you want to retire? Is it 60? Is it 61? Is it 62? Is it 55, 58, 59? What does that look like? When does your spouse want to retire as well? Are you the same age? So, if you're not the same age, like if your spouse is 5 years older or 5 years younger, well, they're 61. Or do you want to be working or not working when they are working, or do you want to try and retire together? So, think about that as well if you and your spouse aren't the same age. How much will you spend? So, what are those spending expectations? So, what do you want to spend on hobbies? What do you want to do on vacations? What do you need as like just basic maintenance at that point in time? How much do you need to have saved for that? Have you thought about it? And then how should you invest that money? Like with your savings, how should you invest it? What account should you invest it in? These are all questions. If you don't have the answers for these, you very much need them at that point. So, again, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information for county employees, again, is my retirement plan at investplanadvice.com, or you can reach me at this number here. Again, for Forsyth County employees, all this is covered by the county. So all expenses with our services are covered by the county. If you are not a Forsyth County employee and you're finding this just on our website, feel free to look at our compensation page as well and reach out to any one of our planners, and we'd be happy to sit down and kind of build a plan out for you as well. But I hope you enjoyed this. Please check out our other videos. Please reach out to me if you had any questions around this, and I really hope you guys have a great afternoon. Thanks.